Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. I'm delighted to welcome back Alexandra and Lewis. This is the third in a series of 4 of the Jean Monnet webinar series. These webinars are a form of blended learning, and they accompany the 2-term Jean Monnet module offered under the aegis of the Euromasters here at the IES. And as you remember, and maybe for those of you who may be new, the form and the point of blended learning is, of course, to offer an accompaniment to the traditional classroom-based learning. So for those students who are unable to attend, or who attend and simply feel they need a refresher, or can look at this as a form of preparing for the exam, we're very pleased to be able to offer this kind of output. And again, of course, it's called the Jean Monnet webinar because it's offered in conjunction with the support that we receive from the European Commission under the aegis of the Lifelong Learning Programme, and we have them prominently labelled there on the first slide. So our thanks to them for their ongoing support for that. I'm going to introduce very briefly the running order for today. In a sense, it's sort of a brown bag lunch and an opportunity to learn a lighter one than perhaps we're used to in the past, because we have 2 speakers, and each of them has the luxury to have really only one topic each. Just occasionally they have to tackle 2, which makes for some very condensed presentations. But today we have a little bit more time on our hands, which is marvelous. So I'll do, of course, now the introduction. But then I'm delighted to turn it over to Alexander, who's going to be talking to you about the Libya fracas. The motivations behind it, and the attendant consequences after it. And then after that, turning over to Louis Simon, who is going to be doing the CSDP roundup. Now, for those of you who attended the class, you'll remember that, of course, this is the leitmotif of the whole operation of the whole module. So we continue to look at this from a substantive perspective, but also from a variety of different policy bases. The point, therefore, of course, is to come to this theme again and again. So while I've touched on it in the first semester and then again at the top of the second, I'm delighted that Louis can be here to touch on this again from his own perspective. I'm doing the introductory remarks literally as we speak. Before I get into the substance of it, or I should say Alexander does, this slide reminds those of you watching, and is also a reminder for those of you who see the webinar in the next couple of hours, for the additional output that falls under the aegis of the Jean Monnet chair activities. They're like webinars, but they're a little broader in scope. They don't stem from a module, so to speak. Indeed, they're a series in and of themselves, which we've entitled Diplomacy in Action. But because they're a form of blended learning, we've also entitled them Virtual Roundtable Series. So the idea, therefore, is to offer 6 or 7 of them from the IES, very much in a format that we have going on this morning, with 2 or maybe 3 speakers, or 2 speakers and a discussant. We've already had one. This was kicked off a couple of weeks ago with myself and 2 members of the IES research cluster in European foreign policy, Daniel Fiat and Esther Marie, and it went very well indeed. So just a reminder, therefore, that this is tomorrow, April the 18th. At 2 p.m. Brussels time, and the focus on the second one, having laid out the foundation effectively for European diplomacy, is the European External Action Service, an institution that has had a fierce amount of scrutiny borne upon it in the last couple of years. And of course, we're certainly looking forward to the midterm review, effectively coming up in a couple of months. I'm very delighted that Sven Biskup, very much an expert in his own right, from the Egmont Institute, is going to begin this webinar tomorrow, and he's going to be followed up with Marie Hibelon, actually from the European External Action Service. I think one of the main points of this presentation, of this webinar series, is to draw on people within the service to find out from them how easy and how difficult it is to make policy, the top-down challenges and the member state-based challenges, but also to have an academic perspective running alongside that in parallel fashion. So again, do please take a note of that. Again, like the webinars today, like the Jean Monnet webinars, these are available online on the IES website under the European funding, European projects webpage. So without further ado, I'm delighted to turn it over now to Alexander, who's going to walk us through, I think maybe in 20 or 30 years, what must be one of the most complicated and interesting foreign policy developments for the European Union, and that's the 2011 conflict in Libya. Alexander, over to you.
For that introduction, Amelia. What I intend to do in the next 15 to 20 minutes or so is just give everyone a sort of very brief snapshot of what actually happened in those sunny spring months in 2011. I recall them vividly. Lewis and I were attending the International Studies Association's annual convention in Canada at the time, and we saw the jets fly through into Libyan airspace as we were debating the responsibility to protect amongst academics, and that resulted in some particularly heated discussions at the time. So I have a whole bunch of thoughts that I have been pondering about ever since, really. So let's just kick off with asking ourselves the questions. What actually happened in that strange conflict that erupted in Northern Africa more or less at the very beginning of 2011. Many of you will, of course, recall that there were at the time a whole series of all sorts of events rolling over Northern Africa. We had of course, the first revolution in Tunisia, as one very frustrated young man set himself on fire, and then eventually setting up the whole country on fire, so to speak. And that sort of revolutionary spirit or revolutionary mood, it sort of broadened in a geographic sense and encompassed Libya, as well as Egypt, and as such, that broader phenomenon that was then labeled as alternatively the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening, that sort of unfolded in those series of months in 2011, and Libya was actually the first case in that series of revolutions, if you want to call them that way, that turned really violent and nasty. And in that sense, there are quite a lot of parallels to be drawn with what is happening in Syria to the very present day. So the sort of first analysis of what happened is that Libya was part of a series of revolutions that took place and upset the whole regional order in North Africa and but of course, if one were to zoom in on Libya itself, then you can also put an entirely different perspective on this and analyze this conflict as a sort of erupting civil war in a country that was historically divided pretty deeply and for a very long time already. In the sense that Eastern Libya, Western Libya, of the coastal parts, I mean, have deep and ancient roots as separate political entities, Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, that were sort of unified first under the colonial period and then afterwards under the rule of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. So the civil war perspective, pitting the two different parts of the country, the two main parts, I should say, because you also have the desert territories in the south, the Fezzan province. That is another a secondary major paradigm that one can adopt for analyzing the conflict in Libya. Then, of course, from the point in time where the international community, and in particular the Western coalition that launched a military intervention, got involved. From that point in time onwards, one can also portray the Libya conflict as some sort of interstate war, because it was not just something that was happening inside Libya. It effectively grew in the broader international community, and at the end of the conflict, a whole range of international actors, both international organizations as well as individual states, were involved and played a military or at least a political part in that conflict, coming to some sort of conclusion at the end of the summer. But many parts of those dynamics actually continue to the very present day. The sort of fourth and final paradigm that one can also adopt to analyze the situation confronted in Libya is what academics such as ourselves call the responsibility to protect. That was the idea that we were debating so fiercely from a faraway academic conference as these events unfolded. The whole idea here is that the traditional thinking of state sovereignty would be to some extent passé, and that the sort of new and emerging international order would be based on the idea that a government actually has the responsibility to protect its own population. If that government is unable or unwilling to perform that role, then that responsibility shifts to the higher level of the international community. And in that sense, it was a case of the international community, the United Nations, assigning the military part of that effort to NATO, taking over the responsibility to protect Libyan civilians from being attacked by Gaddafi's security forces. Now there's an enormous debate over the pros and cons over this new international norm of responsibility to protect. Many people are very, very much in disagreement with the idea that this could really be the founding stone of a new international order, and especially once one leaves the confines of the liberal Western thinking on this. In other parts of the world, this whole notion is fiercely contested. So as such, it's always good to remember that this sort of overall spin that was put on analyzing this conflict in Western media actually only tells you part of the story. So this whole conflict that unfolded, it can be read through many different lenses, and the four that we just mentioned here are probably important ones in that regard, but they're definitely not the only ones. And to some extent, these lenses can perfectly overlap with one another, even if they're not always all to be reconciled at the same time either. Now, let's take it one step further and zoom in on the question of what really motivated the international community and then the states that really took the lead in shaping the international community's response to the crisis in Libya. Which states effectively took the lead? Most of you will probably remember that well. We, of course, had France and Britain playing a particularly active role. Italy also a very important player, given that it was the historical colonial power in Libya. Of course, the United States was also deeply involved in the whole military campaign for the very simple reason that running a multinational air campaign that is a pretty complicated endeavor, and not many states are really able to coordinate such difficult military challenges. So, what drove all those countries to be so concerned about the Libya situation, apart from portraying the whole conflict as an issue of principle? Well, first and foremost, you of course had the whole humanitarian aspect of things. The sheer fact that Colonel Gaddafi was willfully targeting parts of his own civilian population and effectively attempted to crush through terror and through force the resistance, the political and popular resistance that had emerged against his long autocratic rule, that was very much a cause that that many nations sympathized with on principle grounds, and the fact that a new humanitarian massacre would unfold at the very edge of the European neighborhood, only 15 years after the terrible wars in the former Yugoslavia. That, of course, it brought up dark memories of what had happened in the Balkans, and there was a political reaction. Let's try and avoid this. Let's try and preempt that whole country from sinking deeper and deeper into civil war, as had happened in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, where the West had by and large stood aside in the beginning of that campaign and only had to intervene at a later stage when it became much more problematic and complicated to do so. But of course, principles, they may be important for writing convincing policy speeches, but principles are not everything in international relations. And of course, you also see that many of those nations that were particularly active in advocating international action to do something about the Libyan crisis were also, to a greater or lesser extent, interested in Libya for a variety of reasons. The first of which is arguably very important for a country like Italy, is of course the issue of migration. When you have a lot of fighting, well, people who are valuing their lives, they attempt to flee. And if you want to flee Libya, well, if you really want to find a safe haven, then you need to get across the sea, preferably into Western Europe. So that means you really want to try and get into Italy, because that is the closest by. And at the peak of the crisis, one had enormous numbers of Libyan refugees arriving on the Italian islands in the Mediterranean Sea, such as Lampedusa. And of course, this sudden influx of people, desperate people fleeing violence, that of course makes the debate over, well, should we do something or should we not do something, makes it particularly acute, and makes and ensures that if you're a political leader in Rome, this is not a purely theoretical problem, because you're impacted by the practical consequences in a very real and immediate sense. Secondly, as far as interests are concerned, one cannot hide the fact that there are also economic considerations that come to play in this. As many of you know, Libya is one of the important exporters of oil and gas in the Northern Africa region. In particular, the very light and sweet oil that many Western nations are critically dependent on for their transport sectors is supplied to an important extent by Libyan refineries. And of course, the whole question of, well, if Libya as a state collapses, implodes, and the oil sector needs to be reconstructed, well, there will be some nations and companies that will win from this, and there will be other companies and nations that will lose from this, that will get a better deal or that get a worse deal. And of course, that makes the whole debate over, well, how active a role do we want to play in this? Which side of the conflict are we going to support? It makes clear that these things have real life repercussions for running European economies, and as such, those considerations cannot be disentangled the whole debate about principles and the other value-based considerations that may be coming into play for debating how to respond to the erupting crisis. Thirdly and lastly, one should always keep in mind that foreign policy is, to some extent at least, always driven by what happens on the domestic front. And domestic politics cannot be underestimated as a driving force in the foreign policy choices that individual leaders sometimes embark on. We know that French President Nicolas Sarkozy was fighting for his own re-election at the time. There is the well-known hypothesis that leaders can benefit from a sudden jump in popularity when a crisis breaks out. They can sort of affirm their image as the leader of the nation. Of course, in Sarkozy's case, it didn't turn out all that well. But this whole domestic politics aspect cannot be forgotten. In the British case, one can, for example, also refer to the fact that the whole release of the Lockerbie bomber, the Libyan terrorist that had effectively helped downing a civilian airliner over Scotland many years before all this happened. The fact that the British government released him from jail, and that when the man returned to Libya, that he was sort of welcomed by Gaddafi as a national hero. Well, of course, that cannot have played well with British domestic audiences, and as such, ancient grudges such as these, they may very well come up again when new dossiers are being negotiated. Okay, now after the sort of question how to analyze the conflict and how to understand the various motivations that were driving the different international actors to get engaged, a few words about outcomes. Where are we now? Well, the first key issue to take away from this discussion in that regard is that Libya set an important precedent in the whole debate over to what extent should the international community get engaged in this whole series of revolutions in the broader Middle East. Well, in the case of Libya, there was more or less a unified front on what to do. The air campaign was officially endorsed by the UN Security Council. There was a Chapter 7 mandate for it. There was support from the Arab League for that course of action. But as the whole series of events unfolded in 2011, many people got scared at what it actually entailed. The idea that protecting civilians through military means, through setting up a no-fly zone, but in fact, it actually implied supporting one side in an ongoing civil war, and protecting civilians also meant going after the bad guys that were shooting the civilians, i.e., moving from a defensive posture to an offensive posture, and actually go after and target the governmental forces that were loyal to Colonel Gaddafi. And in that sense, what is going on in terms of debating whether or not the world should intervene in Syria, the whole precedent of Libya is very much in the backs of everyone's mind, in the sense that players like Russia and China are very adamant not to authorize any sort of international response that is signed off by the UN Security Council, because they now have an argument. Well, once we put our signature under any type of mandate, well, other nations will sort of use that mandate as a cover to do to engage in actions that go far beyond what we actually want. And to a great extent, the fact that the UN Security Council is in total deadlock over the whole Syria situation is to an important extent the consequence of how the events in Libya unfolded. Sorry, my throat is holding me back a tiny bit. What is also interesting in terms of outcomes is that after the hostilities ended in the late summer of 2011, it was actually the United Nations that took the leadership as far as post-conflict stabilization was concerned. And many security analysts working here in Brussels had actually sort of expected that the European Union would play a very prominent role in taking care of this new state of Libya that was in dire need for external assistance, and that did not materialize. So the European Union abstained from engaging militarily with the problem, and of course the European Union is now very much engaged in financially assisting the reconstruction of the Libyan state. But as far as the political coordination of that effort is concerned, the leadership is very much ceded to the United Nations, which now has its own support mission in Libya. Having said that, it's also important to keep in mind that we still confront a pretty chaotic situation. There are still a lot of militias that are operating throughout Libya. And as the attacks on the US consulate in Benghazi last year showed, there is still a very, very significant potential for violence that is residing within the country. And as such, we sort of have a habit of now looking back at the conflict in Libya as if it has really ended in the summer of 2011. But in a broader political and strategic sense, many things are still up for grabs to the present day. And then last but not least, one also needs to bear in mind that the whole conflict in Libya and the international involvement that it brought along also played a very, very important role in destabilizing the wider region. And if we, for example, look at what is now happening in Mali, that can to a very significant extent be traced back to the conflict in Libya, in the sense that the people that we call the rebels in northern Mali, well, many of them were actually mercenaries fighting for Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and once Gaddafi got killed, they effectively hedged their bets, took everything they could carry along into the desert and set up shop elsewhere. So what we are confronting now in the broader Sahel region is very much intertwined with the early conflict in Libya, and in that sense, what is happening in Egypt, what is happening in Syria, there are interconnections between all of these turbulent environments that are not openly discussed, but that are nonetheless very, very real. As some sort of conclusion to all of this, the two main ideas that come to my mind is that Libya has really led to much soul searching on the broader theme of European defense, for the very reason that it was clear that only a handful of European nations was ready to commit to the military tasks in Libya, and even those that were actually on the front line, they were to a significant extent hindered by their own military inability to pull off all of this on their own. That is, without the assistance of the United States. As one very silly example, many of them involved in the air campaign came close to running out of munition because they had very little stocks of every specific type of munition. And at the same time, there is also this idea, well, if the United States is no longer able or willing to continue playing that role of being sort of the overall architect of European security, what does it really mean for Europeans? And if the United States were to shift more of its resources and attention to other parts of the world, i.e. the Asia-Pacific region, well, it logically entails that Europeans will have to pick up ever more responsibility for their own neighborhood, and that neighborhood in the south is a particularly turbulent one. And in that sense, everything that is happening in Northern Africa is very much the business of the Europeans, whether they like it or not, for the very simple reasons that they are very proximate to all of this in a geographic sense. I am absolutely sure that we'll hear much more about all this type of thinking from Lewis in his presentation on the EU's common security and defense policy. So let me thank you all for listening to me, and I'll hand over the floor and look forward to answering any questions that you may have after the next presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that, Alexander. I hope you all enjoyed Alexander's presentation on Libya, which is, as I'm sure you all know, a very timely and hot topic. Actually, I'm sorry to disappoint Alexander, because I'm not going to be speaking about what's going on today in Libya or the southern neighborhood, but hopefully we can talk about these issues during the Q&A. What I'm going to do, rather, hopefully 10 minutes, so we can 10-15 minutes for questions and answers, is try and summarize the main points that I made during the lecture that I gave recently on the EU's common security and defense policy. So first, I'm very briefly going to introduce the different schemes of European foreign security and defense cooperation during the Cold War, and then I'll look at how European foreign and security policy cooperation has evolved after the Cold War to focus on CSDP specifically, meaning going through the evolution of CSDP from 1999 onwards. Now, just a brief remark before starting. As I mentioned in the lecture, the Common Security and Defense Policy, CSDP, is part of the Common Foreign and Security Policy, meaning it's subordinated to it. And I think this is something that is worth mentioning, because this is an arrangement that is very specific to the European Union. It's actually, for most actors, meaning most states, foreign policy and security and defense policy are organically and financially separated. For instance, in the United States, the Pentagon and the State Department are bureaucratically, financially independent from each other. And this is not the case in the European Union. The Lisbon Treaty is very explicit in saying that CSDP is an instrument of CFSP. And this means that in order to understand the origins of CSDP, we must first understand the origins of European foreign and security policy cooperation more broadly. So let's do that very quickly before, oops, it's not working. Yeah, before we turn into CSDP proper. So as I mentioned in the lecture a few weeks ago, during the Cold War, Europeans engaged in a number of European-only, and I say European-only because, as most of you know, like the bulk of European defense cooperation during the Cold War took place in the transatlantic framework, in the framework of NATO. But despite that fact, Europeans engaged in a number of European foreign security and defense policy cooperation ventures during the Cold War. I think the three most prominent examples in this regard would be the Western European Union, which is an institution that was set up in 1947 and managed to survive all the way to 2011. Actually, it was only killed barely 2 years ago. However, the WEU never quite managed to get rid of this image as a talking shop. Another example would be the European Defence Community, which was a project that was tabled by the French in 1950, but to be also rejected by the French National Assembly this time in 1954. I mean, it was tabled by the French executive, and it was killed by the French legislative in 1954. And another example, which is perhaps most relevant for all of us, is European political cooperation, because this was a scheme that was adopted in 1970 to strengthen foreign policy cooperation among the member states of the European community, and which would be eventually replaced in 1992 by the EU's common foreign and security policy. Now, since we only have 15 minutes, I'm not going to get into the details of each individual arrangement. We can tackle that in the Q&A if need be. Now, with the end of the Cold War, the Maastricht Treaty established, as most of you know, as all of you know, I hope, a roadmap for economic and monetary union, EMU, and this was a historic step in the completion of the European single market. But the monetary union, the single market, was not all there was to Maastricht. With the setting up of the so-called second and third pillars, the common foreign and security policy and justice and home affairs respectively, the Treaty on European Union would take the European integration process to a different level, beyond the single market. Now, I think the two main changes brought about by the Maastricht Treaty in relation to the creation of CFSP, I think, were the promise to bring about a common defense policy, which was a subject that European political cooperation during the Cold War had explicitly ruled out, but also was the fact that the Maastricht Treaty sort of formalized European foreign policy cooperation in a way that European policy cooperation during the Cold War didn't. Because European policy cooperation was a very loose and informal arrangement. But in contrast to that, the CFSP, with the Treaty of Maastricht, CFSP included two legal figures that were aimed at making European foreign and security policy cooperation stronger and more formal. These are joint actions and common positions. Now, 5 years after the Maastricht Treaty, the 1997 Amsterdam Treaty even deepened cooperation in the area of foreign and security policy at the European level, at the European Union level. I think the Amsterdam Treaty brought about three main changes, I would say, in the area of CFSP. The introduction of the common strategy, which is a figure that sort of stands above joint actions and common positions and helps frame them, and then the creation of the position of a high representative for CFSP, which would give a face and a voice to European foreign policy from 1997. And also the creation of a new mechanism that would facilitate decision-making in the area of CFSP, which was the mechanism of constructive abstention. Now, again, since we only have a few minutes left, I'm not gonna go into further details about these three changes. Let's now move on to what happened after the Amsterdam Treaty, because and this is where it gets relevant for us, because it was 2 years after Amsterdam, at the 1999 European Council in Cologne, when the European Union finally took up the promise of the Maastricht Treaty of adopting a common security policy. As I was saying, the Maastricht Treaty already laid out the vision of a common defense policy for the European Union back when CFSP was created. However, the British opposed the idea at Maastricht, and they opposed the idea again at Amsterdam. But 2 years after Amsterdam, they changed course, and therefore made it possible for the European Union to start the common security and defense policy. Or, well, back then it was called the European Security and Defense Policy. So, and this happened at the Cologne European Council, where the European Council committed to a critical expansion of the common foreign and security policy by declaring that the European Union, and now I'm quoting from the Cologne European Council, should have the capability for autonomous action backed up by credible military forces, the means to decide to use them, and a readiness to do so in order to respond to international crises. And I think the Petersburg tasks provide a reference of the kind of tasks that the newly created European security and defense policy would concentrate on. And the Petersburg tasks are listed on the next slide. They include humanitarian and rescue tasks, peacekeeping tasks, and tasks of combat forces in crisis management, including peacemaking, which is the one task that implies a higher level of military ambition and of military intensity. Now, if the Cologne European Council provided the common security and defense policy with a vision that turned around conflict prevention and Petersburg-style crisis management, the December 1999 Helsinki European Council, only 6 months after Cologne, translated that sort of political vision into operational language, into an operational vision, and this was laid out by the so-called 2003 headline goal, which was agreed at Helsinki in December 1999. According to the headline goal, and again I'm quoting from the Council declaration, by the year 2003, Europeans will be able to deploy rapidly and then sustain forces capable of a full range of Petersburg tasks as set out in the Amsterdam Treaty, including the most demanding operations, in operations up to corps level, up to 15 brigades or 50 to 60,000 troops. Now, this is very ambitious, and as we'll be able to talk about later, the EU has kind of retreated in a way, and CSDP has not met such high expectations, at least not until today. Now, 6 months after Helsinki, the Helsinki European Council, civilian CSDP was initially about military power, about military force, about the ability to be able to project military power outside of Europe, but a number of member states wanted to introduce a lighter dimension to CSDP, and this was finally agreed 6 months after the Helsinki European Council, when civilian CSDP was born at the June 2000 EU Council at Santa Maria de Feira in Portugal. And back then, as it was the case with military CSDP, there was a so-called civilian headline goal, the 2003 civilian headline goal, which was aimed at sort of laying out the kind of vision, the kind of operational objectives that the civilian CSDP would aspire to, which would be deploying about 5,000 police officers for missions across the range of conflict prevention and crisis management by 2003. And additionally, 1,000 policemen should be ready for rapid deployment within a 30-day notice. Okay, so now once the operational objectives of CSDP, both military and civilian, had been set by the 2003 military and civilian headline goals, the December 2000 European Council at Nice in France established the relevant permanent political and military structures that would provide the institutional foundation of the CSDP, and this include, and again, I don't have time to go through them individually, the Political and Security Committee, the European Union Military Committee, the European Union Military Staff, and the Civilian Planning and Conduct Capability. Now, after the operational vision of CSDP was laid out by the headline goals and the main institutional structures were created after Nice, I would say that the second biggest push in the area of CSDP came in late 2003, and this was in the context of the broader negotiations over the 2004 Constitutional Treaty, which would eventually become the Lisbon Treaty, and also in the context that was defined by the inter-European and inter-transatlantic divisions associated with the Iraq War. Now, of the several changes that came about in CSDP between 2003 and 2004, I would say that 4 are particularly important. And these are the creation of the European Defence Agency in 2003. Well, the decision was made in 2003. The agency was actually set up in 2004. The launch of CSDP's first civilian operation in January 2003 in Bosnia, and the first military operation in the former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia also in 2003. The creation and the creation of the battle group concept in early 2004. So these are the 3 I said before, the 3 main changes that were brought about in 2003 in the area of CSDP. And I see that we're totally running out of time. So I'm going to almost end it here. Just very quickly tell you about the main novelties the Lisbon Treaty brought in the area of CSDP. And actually, there aren't many of them because, as all of you know by now, the Lisbon Treaty brings about very important and very significant systemic changes in the area of CFSP, such as the creation of the European External Action Service, of the merger of the positions of Commissioner on External Affairs and High Representative for CFSP, but the Lisbon Treaty contains very few novelties in the area of CSDP proper, in the area of defense. The most are the expansion of the Petersburg tasks to include a post-conflict stabilization and the fight against terrorism, and the introduction of a new legal political mechanism to facilitate European capability development, which is called permanent structure cooperation. The problem is that there has been no agreement to activate a permanent structure to develop permanent structure cooperation after the Lisbon Treaty due to political disagreements among the biggest member states. And ever since 2011, permanent structure cooperation has been pushed off the political agenda of CSDP and has been replaced by a much looser and informal format, which is called pooling and sharing. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that, and looking forward to the questions and the discussion. Thank you.
All right, that was a very complimentary presentation. I think we can sort of go on and on about this really, but many thanks, Lewis, for giving that talk. Can I just inquire whether the online audience has any questions for us? You can type them into the chat box, or you can switch on your camera and microphone as you wish. The old software had this system where you could also raise your hand in a digital fashion, but I don't see that in this particular platform.
I just wanted to make a brief comment, a quick reaction to what Alexander said. He said that in the context of the pivot to Asia, there's a likelihood that Europeans will come to play a bigger role in their broader neighborhood, to sort of replace the U.S. as the U.S. pivots away from the European neighborhood and onto Asia. And I just want to say that I agree and disagree with that in a way. I agree in the sense that the U.S. pivot to Asia will mean that the United States will play, and in fact it's already playing, a more indirect role in European security, and we can appreciate that in the evolution of Europe, which is moving away from a heavy presence concentrated around Central Europe, particularly Germany and Italy, to a much lighter presence, much more flexible forces deployed around the European periphery. And it's also evolving from a concept of direct presence to one of engagement through partnerships and training and other initiatives such as cybersecurity or ballistic missile defense. However, and this is the part where I disagree a bit with what Alexander was saying. I think that that the United States is not going. I mean, the pivot to Asia does not mean that the United States. And I'm not saying that this was something Alexandra was saying, but it's something a lot of people, a lot of security experts in Europe imply or say directly, is that the pivot to Asia does not mean that the United States will abandon Europe. I think the U.S. continues to have very important strategic interests in Europe, including using Europe as a base and a source of support, operational and political, for deployments into the Middle East. And I think the United States will just have to make the most out of a reduced presence in Europe, and will strive to maintain a maximum degree of influence possible with a minimum presence possible, sort of so to speak, to get the most bang out of a light footprint. So that's the only remark I wanted to make. Do you guys have any? Oh, there seems to be a question. Energy security a part of CSDP? If not, should it be? And can it be, as there is no EU common energy policy? Well, that's a very good question, right? But I think you yourself are answering that question. And so long as there is no common EU energy policy, energy cannot be a part of CSDP. This was a question that was perhaps hotter a few years ago than it is now, and that it sort of projected over the debate on the over the Russian intervention in Georgia, but more so in a NATO framework. I mean, the energy dossier has not come anywhere close the CSDP debates. But maybe Amelia wants to say something about that, since this is her area of expertise. But Alexander, do you have any additional thoughts on this?
Well, in a formal sense, there is like energy is not something that is typically treated as an issue for the CSDP agenda. Of course, if you zoom out and take a sort of holistic view of European defense, then of course energy security does enter the picture. But that is something that is a discussion that is being pursued in multiple frameworks, of which European cooperation is but one. So in a way, we are confronted with a policy dossier that is sort of cut into different little pieces that are all implemented in different contexts. Some in bilateral discussions, some through an EU framework, others through a NATO framework. Well, the short answer was no. I don't think I have main really big issues to contribute still on this. But perhaps let me take the opportunity to wrap up this session here. But warmly invite everyone to plug in for the next session, which will take place on the 8th of May. That is Quo Vadis Part 4. That features the list of speakers that you see on the slide here. All right. Having said that, I think we've sort of burned through the allotted time. Thanks everyone for plugging in, and we look forward to seeing you again online, hopefully without technical hiccups, at the 8th of May. Thank you. Have a good day.